Hello everyone, it's Shannon here and welcome to Waffle Flower's August release blog hop. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to create a glazing chart using distress inks, and from that chart we are going to create two cards. I'm going to start by creating my glazing chart. The first thing I need to do is stamp my grid. I'm using the new Color Swatches Stamp Set to create this grid. I'm going to stamp it onto watercolor paper. I'm using B paper, which comes in 6x9 sheets. I just cut one of those sheets in half, so I am going to stamp this on a panel that is 6x4.5. I inked up the stamp in VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a waterproof ink, and I'm now going to stamp it on my watercolor paper. I'm stamping it towards the left side of my paper because I want to save some room because I want to turn this 24 swatch grid into a 36 swatch grid. I'm using a Martha Stewart stamping block to stamp this grid. This block, as well as the B paper I'm stamping on, and the color swatching stamp set, and the swatch stamp set, all are part of the Card Maker's swatch kit. So I'm now inking up those two columns, or focusing on inking up those two columns on the left. I did get some ink on the other side, but I'm going to use some copy paper, which I have in my hand on the right there, to kind of mask those other columns, so I only stamped two columns onto my watercolor paper. So I'm now sliding that copy paper, making sure it's right between the middle of the grid. I do this by looking through that acrylic block and making sure mainly the top edge and bottom edge of that copy paper, I can see it lining up right in the middle. Once it's lined up, I stamp it, and now I have a perfect 36 swatch grid. So these are the 5 distress inks I will be watercoloring with today and be creating my glazing chart with. I know I stamped a 6-row, 6-column chart, but one of the row and column will be designated for my mass tone or my baseline color of these inks. I'm going to get some of the ink out of the pad simply by smushing it down onto some plastic. I do have a white paper underneath the plastic so you guys can see the color a little bit better. I sprayed some water down onto this plastic palette, and now I'm just mixing some of that water up with that distress ink, and now I'm going to paint one of these squares. I'm not going to paint that very first square of my swatch. That is because that one's going to be left blank. I'm going to paint this entire column with this distress ink. This is Picked Raspberry, and I will paint the remaining 4 columns with the remaining 4 distress ink colors. So that I just did was Spiced Marmalade. Now I'm doing Mustard Seed. I'll now move on to Peacock Feathers, and then I'll finish up with Salty Ocean. Now if you never heard of glazing before, that is a watercolor term, and what it simply means is you are layering your watercolors one on top of the other, letting the first layer dry before you layer on the second color. We're going to do this with distress inks today, and we're making a chart because when you layer one color on top of the other, you're going to create a new color, and so the chart will be a guide for us to know what colors we create by layering one distress ink on top of the other. As you can see here, I've already started painting in my first row of my glazing chart. All of my columns were completely dry before I started this. I'm starting with Picked Raspberry again, and as you can see, I'm already getting new shades of color by layering this Picked Raspberry on top of my 5 shades of ink. I'm going to paint this entire row with Picked Raspberry, and then I'll move on to my next row and I will use Spiced Marmalade, and then my next row will be Mustard Seed, then Peacock Feathers, then Salty Ocean, so just in the same order as I did the columns. Now I do have this sped up, so this video is not ridiculously long, but I did want to point out here that you are kind of missing, because it's being sped up, I am cleaning my brush between each swatch rectangle. This is because distress inks reactivate with liquid on top, so when I put my new ink on top of the old ink, the previously colored ink, it's kind of mixing and creating a new color, and I will pick up some of that new color on my brush, and if I don't clean my brush before I move to the next swatch rectangle, I'll be transferring that new color into the next swatch rectangle. So it's just important here that you do clean your brush in between swatch rectangles. So I'm almost done with peacock feathers, then I'll move on to my last row, which is salty ocean. This chart is going to be very useful for helping me understand how these inks look when they're layered on top of each other. This is great for when you're laying your inks, like with ink smooshing or painting, like what I'm going to do today for my cards. This is just a really great guide to understand how distress inks look when you layer one on top of the other, and the new colors that you create by doing that. So now that my chart is completely dry, let's look at it a little bit more closely. First, I want to remind you of the order that we painted this. We did all the columns first and all the rows second. I wanted to point that out because some of the swatches may seem a little redundant, but here we did peacock feathers first and then picked raspberry on top. And over here we did picked raspberry first with peacock feathers on top. And as you can see, these swatches are a little bit different. So how you, or the order you layer your distress inks can matter as well. I'm really happy with the palette of colors that I got here by mixing these 5 distress inks together. The only 2 shades I'm not too crazy about are the 2 shades I got by mixing the Sparse Marmalade with the peacock feathers and the salty ocean. But overall, it's a really beautiful palette. Here's one of the first palettes that I did. So I used a mustard seed, peacock feathers, and picked raspberry, but I also used wilted violet and candied apple, and I really didn't like the way this palette turned out. And this was the original 5 that I picked, and I thought these would work well together. So I really did learn a lot by creating this glazing chart. I really started to understand which colors really looked well layered on top of each other. Here's one where I thought I was playing a little bit more safe, where I just picked blues and greens, that these should look really well together when mixed or layered on top. But I did find a couple shades of green that I wasn't too crazy about, and that was the Blueprint Sketch over Twisted Citron and the Squeezed Lemonade. So I did find this a very educational process by making these glazing charts. Now that I have my distress inks all figured out, I have a great palette of 5 inks that I know work really well together. I'm going to start on my card. I'm going to create an embossed background on a panel of watercolor paper here. This is the B paper again. It's an A2 panel. I'm going to stamp repeatedly this chart, this 2 color mixing chart from the Color Swatches Stamp Set to create my background. So I just stamped it here with Versamark ink, and now I will dip it into some white embossing powder. Even though I said I'm stamping this repeatedly, I'm going to do it in stages just so I don't mess up my embossing. So I'm now heat setting that embossing, and now I'm stamping this chart again. I am overlapping this a little bit over the first chart that I stamped. After I heat emboss this, I will hold it up to the camera here so you can hopefully see it a little bit better. It is white on white, so it is going to be a bit difficult to see. So I'm holding up to the camera here so you can see kind of when the light catches on the embossing. You'll kind of see here where I overlapped a little bit this chart. I'm just doing this so it's kind of like a continuous column, and I thought it made for a more interesting background. So here's the background completed, and I also made another panel with the same 2 color mixing chart. I did stamp this one a little bit differently. I just stamped this chart. I didn't overlap it, but I did offset each row that I stamped. So now I'm going to move on to watercoloring this in. So for the first panel, we're going to do some glazing. We're going to start by creating some stripes of color, just kind of like how we did when we painted our chart. I'm starting with Pick Raspberry again here. I am painting a row first, but I actually changed my mind and decided I actually wanted to start with columns. So I made a little mistake here, but it's not really going to matter at all in the end. So now I'm starting with my first column with Picked Raspberry. I'm going to paint these columns in rainbow order. So it's going to start with Picked Raspberry, and then I'm going to count down. You see me counting down my columns here, so I know where my next column of Picked Raspberry is going to be, and I'm painting that while I've got it on my brush here and it's all mixed up and ready to go. Once I finish this column, I'll move on to my next shade of ink, which is Spiced Marmalade, and I will continue this process till I have all my columns painted in rainbow order. So we're basically creating a plaid here with our stripes of ink, and where they layer, they're going to create a new color, which is very similar to a plaid. We are painting directly on top of our heat embossed charts that we stamped earlier in the background, and the embossed lines are basically serving as resist, so they're resisting the distress ink and they're remaining white, and that's just going to add a little bit more visual interest to this striped or plaid background that we are creating here. So I'm just about finished with my columns here. I'm painting my last column with Salty Ocean, and once I finish that, I'm now ready to move on to my rows. So my rows here is where I'm really glazing. This is where I'm really overlapping one color with another color and creating new colors. And just like when we did our glazing with our color chart or our glazing chart, we had to be very careful, or I had to be very careful of when I was switching to a new swatch rectangle. I didn't want to take color from that previous swatch rectangle that was still on my brush and paint my new rectangle with that color. So I just want to point out here that I am cleaning my brush just like I did before with our glazing chart in between each one of these little rectangles that I'm painting here. That way I don't cross-contaminate these rectangles and get like a weird muddy color, which would likely happen. As I finish this panel up, I'm going to play a little bit of music for you guys, and I'll meet you back when I'm just about done. Okay, so I'm back. I finished the panel, and I'll hold it up to the camera so you can get a better look. I love the beautiful rainbow colors and all the new colors we got through glazing. So now I'm going to finish up this second panel. I went ahead and painted in some stripes off camera because you guys have already seen me do that already. And I have my glazing chart handy here right on the left. And I'm going to refer to that frequently just to kind of be a reminder of what my colors are going to look like when I layer them on top of each other. I'm starting again with picked raspberry here, and I am not going to paint stripes anymore. I'm going to paint in the little rectangles or squares, and I'm going to do this sort of randomly throughout this panel. Since I like the way picked raspberry looks with all of the ink colors, I'm going to paint a rectangle from each row of color with picked raspberry. So basically there'll be a section of each row painted with picked raspberry, and once I finish that, I'll move on to my next color. And I even paint the rows that are picked raspberry with picked raspberry itself, and that I do for each color. So now I'm moving on to spiced marmalade. So I'm painting a section in the spiced marmalade row with that color, and then I'm going over to some other areas or some other rows, like I'm doing the picked raspberry right now with the spiced marmalade because I know I like those two colors layered together. So I'm going to have the colors that I'm using on screen for you guys so you can follow along. I'm going to play a little bit more music, and I'll meet you back when I'm just about done. Okay, so I'm back and I have finished my panel, and now it's time to assemble my cards. I went ahead and adhered the panels to two A2 top folding card bases made from 110-pound white cardstock. I'm now going to complete the cards with some sentiments. I die cut these circles out of white cardstock and vellum using the Flower Circles die set and the Nesting Circles 1 die set, and then adhered them together. Then I stamped and heat embossed a sentiment that I created with the Balloon Messages stamp set and the Sunshine stamp set, and then I just added some foam tape, and now I'm adding them to my cards, and that will complete my cards. Now I'll hold them up to the camera so you can get a better look. I really enjoyed making these cards today. I really like to glaze, especially with Distress ink, because they're translucent. They really do create new colors very easily, and it's really fun to play with them. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video and cards. If you want any more information on the products I use, please visit Waffle Flower, and thank you so much for joining me today.